Greetings, friends. I am Vitaly Portnikov. Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi has sent Indian servicemen to participate in Russian-Belarusian military exercises. 65 Indian servicemen are stationed at the Russian Mulino training ground 65 kilometers from Nizhny Novgorod. The Ministry of Defense of India stated that their presence and joint training with Russian soldiers will help strengthen defense cooperation between the Russian Federation and India. The fact that the Indian government decided to send contingents to the Russian-Belarusian exercises was another demonstration of the desire to strengthen relations with Russia and China in a render fashion, against the background of ongoing pressure from the President of the United States, Donald Trump. Another such step was the presence of the Indian Prime Minister at the summit of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization in China's Tianjin. Prior to that, for 7 years, Fashion had not visited the People's Republic of China, even to participate in collective summits which were chaired by Xi Jinping. And the head of the People's Republic of China avoided traveling to India to participate in collective summits, where he presided over the render Fashion. But now all this is in the past, despite the ongoing economic competition between China and India, and border disagreements between the two countries. And if anyone can be thanked for this emerging understanding between New Delhi and Beijing, it's Donald Trump. Yes, of course, the American president acted quite sensibly when he imposed 50% sanctions against India for the purchase of Russian oil. Although now there are serious doubts that these sanctions were the reason, and not the reason, for the deterioration of relations between the United States and India, and that Donald Trump decided to punish Fashion on the render not so much for cooperation with Vladimir Putin, but decided to change the balance of economic relations between Washington and New Delhi, or worse, decided to take revenge on Fashion on the render for the fact that the Indian Prime Minister does not notice Trump's absent peacekeeping efforts in the latest conflict between India and Pakistan. However, from the point of view of the same common sense, the United States of India could at least hold consultations before these tariff decisions of Donald Trump, based on the relationship of strategic partnership between the two countries. After all, the United States has no other ally in the region in relations with China, and, apparently, it will not be in the foreseeable future. And the alliance of China, India and Russia is a serious enough mechanism to undermine the position of the United States throughout Asia. Anyone who would make a decision about tariffs could think in this direction. But not Donald Trump. Of course, Fashion would have to think about the consequences of the deterioration of its relations with the United States from a formal point of view. But the very political style of the Indian Prime Minister and the ideology of his own party dictates a tougher attitude to any pressure from the West in the render Fashion than it could have happened with previous Indian leaders. In order to remain in power on the Fashion render, it is necessary to demonstrate to the citizens of India a fairly tough and confident attitude to what in India may be considered disrespect of the country and colonial pressure on its policy. That is why the Fashion on the render, it seems, did not hesitate for a long time. And his relations with China and Russia have become for the Indian Prime Minister the main trump card for demonstrating to both Americans and compatriots what his response to Donald Trump will look like. At the same time, the Prime Minister of India demonstrates every readiness to find a common language with the American president. But we understand perfectly well what this mutual understanding should look like. In much the same way as with China, Donald Trump should abandon his tariffs against India, and thus forget about the idea that India should stop buying Russian oil. And in this situation, the American president has practically no levers left to put pressure on Russian President Vladimir Putin. And thus, there is no way to say that with the help of economic pressure, he can force Putin to stop the war. But, of course, with the development of this plot on the render, the fashion goes further and further. It's one thing to have official talks on the sidelines of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit and hugs with Vladimir Putin, whom he called his close friend long before the conflict with Donald Trump. For almost the entire period of the Great Russian-Ukrainian War, the Indian Prime Minister maintained warm relations with his Russian confidant, visited Moscow, and argued that it was necessary to continue developing strategic relations between Russia and India. Hey, even a trip on a render mode to Kiev and his calls to end the war between Russia and Ukraine did not interfere with this strategic understanding between Putin and fashion. But the presence of military personnel, and even at those exercises that are, as it were, really directed towards the West, where Russian and Belarusian soldiers will work out just possible clashes with military personnel of NATO member countries, and maybe aggression against neighboring Central European countries, which, against the background of the appearance of Russian drones in the sky over Poland and Romania, no longer looks like a theory, but rather a possible development of historical events in Europe in the coming years and even months. This is a much more serious and powerful signal towards the West and a demonstration that Donald Trump has alienated India with his inept policy and deprived America and the West as a whole of a strategic partner. At the same time, it is clear that the situation will not improve because now the main trump card of the American president is in his desire to find those to blame for the fact that he fails to reach an agreement with Putin. These are calls for European countries to impose tariffs against China and India or any sanctions against Chinese or Indian companies, so that they stop buying Russian oil. Thus, we can predict a further rapprochement between China, India, and the Russian Federation, a further loss of the United States' position in Southeast Asia, and a possible misunderstanding between the United States and the European Union in terms of how to act with New Delhi if the West wants to maintain any relations with India against the background of cooling with Russia and China. Well, in a word, Donald Trump, as always, is doing well. Thank you, friends. Stay on this channel, subscribe to it, subscribe to my social networks for channels in Patreon, BAME, Coffee, and Donatello, which helps to develop these user resources and sponsorship functions in YouTube itself. Peace to you.